My name is Travis. I've been hauling freight for about 12 years, mostly running the Interstate 80 corridor between Pennsylvania and Illinois. When you're driving those flat, repetitive stretches of road at 4 in the morning, your mind starts to play tricks on you. You see shadows dancing in the cornfields, or you think a deer is about to jump out when it's just a plastic bag. But what happened to me 2 years ago near Des Moines wasn't a trick of the light. It was a calculated, slow-motion nightmare. I was pulling a heavy load of industrial machinery headed for a warehouse in Omaha. It was a Tuesday night, middle of October, and the fog was so thick you could cut it with a pocket knife. My headlights were barely piercing 30 feet of the gloom. I was exhausted, the kind of tired that makes your bones ache, but I was only 90 minutes from my destination, and I didn't want to stop. I was cruising at about 60 miles per hour when I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear-view mirror. They were dim, one of them slightly flickered, and they were staying exactly 4 car lengths behind my trailer. For 10 miles, those lights didn't budge. I sped up to 65. They sped up. I slowed down to 55. They slowed down. Probably just some kid drafted off my wake to save gas, I muttered to myself. It's common enough. But then, the car did something strange. It pulled out into the left lane as if to pass me. I watched the silver sedan, an old, beat-up model from the early 2000s, creep up alongside my trailer. It stayed there, hovering right next to my rear wheels. It didn't pass. It just sat in my blind spot for 5 minutes. I started to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tapped my brakes lightly to give him a hint, but the driver didn't react. Finally, the sedan accelerated and pulled up right next to my cab. I looked down from my window. The car had tinted windows, so dark I couldn't see the driver, but the passenger side window was rolled down about 2 inches. A hand reached out of that gap. It wasn't waving. It was holding a professional-grade digital camera pointed straight up at me. The flash went off, snap, bright enough to momentarily blind me. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving slightly. The silver sedan didn't speed off. It slowed down, tucked itself back behind my trailer, and turned its lights completely off. Now I was terrified. I was a 10-ton rig flying down a foggy highway at 60 miles per hour, and there was a ghost car sitting right on my tail that I couldn't see anymore. I reached for my CB radio, but all I got was dead air and a weird, rhythmic clicking sound. Click, 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 click. I realized then that my cell phone, which was sitting in the cup holder, was glowing. I hadn't touched it, but the screen was active. I glanced down. Someone was trying to airdrop me a file. I stared at that phone screen for what felt like an eternity. My thumb was hovering over the accept button. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to throw the phone out the window, but the curiosity, that sick, gnawing need to know what was happening, won out. I tapped the screen. The file was a single photograph. It was high resolution, crystal clear, despite the fog and the speed. It was a shot of the side of my cab, but it wasn't a shot of me driving. It was a shot taken from a low angle, looking up into my passenger side mirror. In the reflection of that mirror, you could see the interior of my sleeper berth, the small bed area behind my seat. There was a man sitting on my bed. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt, his face obscured by the shadow of the brim. He was holding a long, serrated hunting knife, and he was looking directly at the camera. My blood turned to ice. I didn't breathe. I didn't move my head. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, but every nerve in my back was on fire. I could feel the weight of someone sitting 3 feet behind me. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of breathing that wasn't my own. Psst. Psst. I realized then that the clicking sound on the CB radio wasn't interference. It was the sound of a folding knife being opened and closed, over and over again, right next to the microphone in the back of the cab. I had been driving for 3 hours since my last stop at a rest area in Iowa. I remembered going inside to grab a sandwich and leaving the driver's side door unlocked for just 2 minutes. That was all it took. He'd been back there the whole time, sitting in the dark, watching the back of my head while I sang along to the radio and talked to my wife on the phone. I looked at the rear-view mirror. The silver sedan was still there, but now it had turned its high beams on. They were blinding, reflecting off my side mirrors and filling the cab with a harsh, white glare. They were signaling him. I had to do something. If I slammed on the brakes, he'd fly forward and probably gut me before I could get out of the seatbelt. If I kept driving, they'd wait until I reached a deserted stretch of road to finish the job. I saw a sign for a way station 3 miles ahead. It was usually closed this late on a Tuesday, but I saw the faint amber glow of the open sign. It was my only shot. I shifted gears, trying to keep my movements smooth and natural. I didn't want him to know I'd seen the photo. I reached for my heavy Maglite flashlight in the side pocket of the door, gripping it like a club. "Almost there," I whispered, my voice trembling. As I began to veer toward the exit ramp for the way station, the silver sedan suddenly roared to life. It floored it, pulling up alongside me and swerving violently toward my front tires, trying to force me back onto the main highway. At the same moment, I heard the fabric of the sleeper curtain rustle behind my left ear. "Don't turn into the station, Travis," a voice rasped. It was low, wet, and smelled like stale cigarettes. "Just keep driving to the warehouse. We just want the cargo." I didn't listen. I slammed my foot on the brake and jerked the wheel hard to the right. The trailer screeched, the tires smoking as I forced the massive rig onto the narrow ramp. The man in the back was thrown forward, his head slamming into the back of my seat. I didn't wait. I unbuckled, threw the door open, and leapt out of the moving cab while the truck was still rolling at 20 miles per hour. I hit the gravel hard, rolling into the ditch. I watched as my truck, with the man still inside, crashed through the plastic water barriers at the entrance of the way station and came to a grinding halt against a concrete pillar. The silver sedan didn't stop. It sped past the exit, disappearing into the fog like it was never there. I scrambled to my feet, screaming for help. 2 DOT officers came running out of the small brick building. When they opened the back of my cab, they found a roll of duct tape, a gallon of bleach, and a set of heavy-duty zip ties on the floor of the sleeper. But the man was gone. He had jumped out the passenger door the second the truck hit the pillar. The police searched the woods surrounding the highway for 6 hours with K9 units, but they never found a trace of him. The silver sedan was found 3 days later, abandoned in a cornfield 20 miles south. It had been reported stolen a week prior. I don't drive at night anymore, and I never ever leave my cab unlocked, not even for a second, because every time I hear a clicking sound or see a silver car in my mirror, I remember that photo. I remember the man who sat 3 feet behind me for 3 hours, just waiting for the high beams to flash. This happened back in the summer of 2019. I was working for a small independent outfit out of Oregon, hauling timber down to California. If you've ever driven the Pacific Coast Highway or the back roads through the Redwoods, you know it's some of the most beautiful and loneliest country in the United States. It was about 2 in the morning, and I was navigating a particularly winding stretch of Highway 101. The fog was rolling in off the ocean, thick and salty, clinging to the giant trees like a wet blanket. I was running a bit heavy, so I was taking the curves slow, maybe 35 miles per hour. I rounded a sharp bend when my headlights caught a figure standing on the narrow shoulder. Now, rule number 1 of trucking is, you never pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of a national forest at 2 in the morning. But as I got closer, I saw it was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. She was wearing a thin white t-shirt and blue jeans, and she was shivering so hard I could see her shoulders shaking from 30 feet away. She wasn't holding a sign, She was just holding her arms, looking at the ground. Damn it, I muttered. I couldn't just leave a kid out there in the middle of nowhere. There are mountain lions in those woods, and worse things too. I slowed the rig down and pulled over about 50 yards ahead of her. I watched her in my side mirror. She didn't run toward the truck. She just walked, slowly, with her head down. I opened the passenger door as she reached the cab. "You okay, kid?" "You're a long way from anything," I said, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. She looked up at me. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were red-rimmed like she'd been crying for days. She didn't say a word. She just climbed into the seat and stared straight through the windshield. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Down the road," she whispered. Her voice was so thin I could barely hear it over the idle of the engine. "Just down the road." "All right, I'm headed for Eureka. I can drop you off at a gas station there. It's about 40 miles. She didn't nod. She didn't thank me. She just sat there, perfectly still. I put the truck back in gear and started rolling. For the first 10 minutes, the silence in the cab was deafening. I tried to make small talk, asking her if she was on vacation or if she lived nearby, but she wouldn't answer. She just kept staring at the road. I noticed she was clutching a small leather satchel in her lap. Her knuckles were white from how hard she was gripping it. "That's a nice bag," I said, desperate to break the tension. She tightened her grip. "It's my father's," she said. It was the most she'd spoken so far. "He told me to keep it safe, no matter what." "Well, you're safe in here," I told her. She turned her head and looked at me then. It was a look I'll never forget. It wasn't fear. It was pity. "No one is safe on this road, Mr. Miller," she said. My heart skipped a beat. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice cracking. I wasn't wearing a name tag, and like I said, I was an independent. My name wasn't on the door. She didn't answer. She just looked back at the road. About 5 miles later, I saw a pair of headlights in the distance coming toward us. As the vehicle got closer, I realized it was a highway patrol cruiser. My first thought was relief. I'd just flag him down, hand the girl over to him, and get back to my job. This situation was getting too weird for me. I started flashing my high beams and slowing down. The cop pulled over on the opposite shoulder, his blue and red lights flickering against the fog. "Stay here," I told the girl. I hopped out of the cab and ran across the road to the cruiser. The officer rolled down his window. He looked tired, his face lined with years of night shifts. "Everything okay, driver?" he asked. "Officer, I picked up a hitchhiker back about 5 miles. A young girl. She's acting very strange, and I think she might be a runaway or in some kind of trouble. I was hoping you could take her." The officer looked past me toward my truck. His expression went from tired to dead serious in a split second. He reached for his radio. "Driver, step back from the vehicle, right now," he commanded. "What? Why?" "There is no one in your passenger seat, son," he said, his voice cold as ice. I spun around. I looked at the cab of my truck. Through the glass of the passenger window, under the bright glow of the street lamp, I could see the seat was empty. But then I saw the door. The passenger door was wide open, and the leather satchel was sitting right there on the floor mat. 3. The sound of that air impact wrench was like a machine gun in the confined space of the shed. Whir, clack, clack, clack. The first bolt fell to the concrete floor with a heavy metallic ring. I threw my weight against the door, but it didn't budge. He had already jammed a steel bar through the external handle. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, driver," the giant rasped through the glass. "Parts are parts. Some are metal, some are organic. The market doesn't care which is which." I scrambled over the center console into the passenger seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked for anything, a tire thumper, a screwdriver, a heavy thermos. My hand landed on a flare gun I kept in the emergency kit under the seat. It was a cheap plastic thing, but it was loaded with a bright red phosphorus shell. Whir, clack, clack, clack. The second bolt hit the floor. The top of the driver's side door began to lean outward, letting in a draft of air that smelled like old grease and copper. I didn't wait for the third bolt. I kicked the passenger door open, but it only swung out 6 inches before hitting a heavy wooden post he'd parked the truck against. He had boxed me in perfectly. I was trapped in my own cab, a steel coffin on wheels. I looked through the rear window into the sleeper berth. There was a small luggage door on the exterior of the truck, used for loading bags. It was tiny, meant for a suitcase, but it was my only exit. I dove into the back, throwing blankets and pillows aside. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers numb from the creeping cold. Outside, I heard the heavy thud of the driver's side door hitting the floor. He was inside the cab now. I could hear his heavy boots crunching on the glass from my broken side mirror. "I can smell the adrenaline, son," he chuckled. "It ruins the taste of the meat, you know. Try to calm down." I popped the luggage latch and squeezed through the opening. It was a tight fit. I felt the jagged metal edge tear through my parka and into my shoulder, but I didn't feel the pain. I dropped 4 feet into the snow behind the truck. The shed was pitch black except for the single work light over the workbench. I stayed low, crawling behind a stack of rusted-out semi-tires. I could hear him moving inside my cab, tossing my things around. "Where'd you go, little rabbit?" I looked toward the main bay doors. They were secured with a heavy sliding bolt and a massive padlock. There was no way out that way. I looked up. High above, near the corrugated roof, there was a small ventilation fan that had been ripped out, leaving a hole about 2 feet wide. I began to climb a rack of shelving units. The metal was slippery with oil, and every time I moved, the rack groaned. I stopped, holding my breath. Clang. He had dropped his wrench. He was stepping out of the cab now. I could see his shadow stretching across the floor, 10 feet long and distorted. He wasn't alone. From the back room, 2 more figures emerged. They were smaller, dressed in rags, moving with a strange, twitching gait. They didn't look like mechanics. They looked like they hadn't seen the sun in years. "Find him," the giant commanded. "He's still in the shed. I didn't hear the side door." I reached the top of the shelving. I was 15 feet off the ground, balanced on a narrow wooden plank. The ventilation hole was 5 feet away. I took a deep breath, gripped my flare gun, and leaped. My fingers caught the edge of the jagged metal siding. I screamed as the metal sliced into my palms, but I hauled myself up. "There!" one of the twitching men shrieked, pointing up. The giant looked up and roared. He grabbed a heavy iron pipe from the floor and hurled it at me with the strength of a professional athlete. It whistled past my ear, slamming into the wall with enough force to dent the steel. I scrambled through the hole and tumbled onto the roof. The wind was howling, a full-blown blizzard now. I slid down the icy metal roof and fell into a snowbank on the far side of the shed. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran through the waist-deep snow, following the faint indentations of the service road. My lungs were burning. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. 10 minutes into my flight, I heard the roar of an engine. The primer gray tow truck was coming. Its yellow fog lights cut through the snow like the eyes of a predator. He was tracking my footprints. I dived off the road, rolling down a steep embankment into a frozen creek bed. I crawled under a fallen pine tree and buried myself in the snow, leaving only a tiny hole to breathe through. The tow truck slowed down right above me. I could hear the idle of the massive engine, the smell of diesel exhaust filling my hiding spot. The giant got out. I could see his heavy boots through the branches of the pine tree, just 3 feet from my face. He stood there for 5 minutes, perfectly still. He was listening. My heart was beating so loud I was sure he could hear it. I gripped the flare gun. If he saw me, I'd give him one red-hot surprise before I went down. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. A heavy branch had snapped under the weight of the snow about 50 yards away. The giant turned his head, hopped back into the tow truck, and floored it toward the sound. I waited until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. I didn't go back to the road. I followed the creek bed for 3 miles, moving in the opposite direction. As the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, I saw the lights of a highway salt truck. I stumbled onto the shoulder of Interstate 70, waving my arms like a madman. The driver of the salt truck, a guy named Pete, saved my life. He wrapped me in a heated blanket and called the state patrol. When the police finally found the shed 2 days later, it was empty. Not just empty of people, everything was gone. The tools, the license plates, the workbench, and my truck. All that was left was a single driver's side door, lying in the middle of the floor with 4 bolts neatly stacked on top of it. They never found the graveyard of trailers. They never found the giant with the gold teeth. But sometimes when I'm driving through the mountains and I see a pair of yellow fog lights in my mirror, I don't slow down. I don't stop for engine lights. I'd rather burn my motor to the ground than ever see a primer gray Peterbilt again. 3 stories. 3 nights that should have been my last. People ask me why I still drive. They say the road is too dangerous, that the world is full of monsters, some with ghosts in their eyes, and some with wrenches in their hands. But here's the truth. The road doesn't create these things. It just reveals them. When you're out there between the cities, in the in-between places where the law is thin and the cell service is zero, you see the world for what it really is. I still haul freight. I still run the night shifts. But I have 3 rules now. 1, never pick up a hitchhiker. 2, never leave the cab unlocked. And 3, if you see a silver sedan or a gray tow truck, you keep your foot on the gas until you see the sun. Because out here, in the dark, the only thing you can truly trust is the hum of your own engine and the miles you leave behind.